I didn't know it at the time, but the camping trip my father insisted on would quietly rearrange the boundaries of my life. Looking back, it wasn't one dramatic moment that changed everything. It was a sequence of ordinary decisions, small, reasonable choices, that led me somewhere I never intended to go to. My name is Alex, and I was 23 then. I had already come out to my family, and while my father, Mark, wasn't expressive about it, he had accepted me in his own reserved way. We shared a calm, practical relationship, built more on routine than conversation. When he suggested a weekend camping trip to clear our heads, I agreed out of habit, not enthusiasm. I thought a few days away from the city might help me feel less stuck in my own thoughts. The third person on that trip was Daniel, my dad's closest friend. Daniel was 38, confident without being loud, the kind of man who made people feel listened to. He had been around my family for as long as I could remember, birthday parties, long drives, quiet evenings on the porch. He was married, settled, and dependable, at least from the outside. To me, he had always been a familiar presence, someone safe and predictable. The drive to the campsite took hours. My father focused on the road, Daniel handled the conversation, and I watched the scenery change from concrete to trees. Daniel asked me about work, about how I was adjusting to adulthood, about things my father rarely brought up. His interest felt genuine, and I found myself answering more honestly than I usually did. Mark listened quietly, nodding now and then, seemingly pleased that we were all getting along. When we arrived, the campsite was quieter than expected. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the sky was already turning gray. As we unpacked, Mark frowned and counted the tents again. Somewhere between planning and packing, a mistake had been made. We had 2 tents, not 3. It's fine, Daniel said easily, before my father could start stressing. We'll make it work. The solution came quickly and logically. Mark would take 1 tent. Daniel and I would share the other. No one laughed, no one hesitated long enough to turn it into a problem. We were adults, after all. There was nothing inappropriate about it. Still, something in my chest tightened as the plan settled into place. That I told myself I was overthinking it. As the afternoon passed, we set up camp and cooked a simple meal. Mark relaxed as he always did outdoors, becoming quieter but more at ease. Daniel moved naturally through the space, helping where needed, offering small jokes, keeping things light. I noticed how attentive he was, not just to me, but to everything around him. It made him seem grounded, reliable. Safe. As evening approached, the temperature dropped faster than expected. We sat by the fire, the crackling wood filling the pauses in conversation. Daniel talked about work stress and how the routine of his life sometimes felt heavier than it should. He didn't complain outright, but there was something tired beneath his words. I listened, unsure why his honesty unsettled me. When it was time to sleep, Mark wished us good night and zipped himself into his tent without another thought. Daniel and I stood in silence for a moment before crawling into ours. The space felt smaller once we were inside, the sounds of the forest pressing in from all sides. That we lay there, facing opposite directions, careful to keep a respectful distance. The quiet stretched. I could hear Daniel's breathing, steady but awake. I realized I was too alert to sleep, my thoughts circling around a feeling I didn't want to name. This was supposed to be a simple trip. Just a weekend. Just a tent. As I stared into the darkness, I had the unsettling sense that something had already shifted, and that whatever came next would not be as easy to step away from as I hoped. Sleep came late and lightly. Every sound outside the tent seemed sharper than it should have been, and every movement inside felt deliberate, as if we were both trying not to disturb something fragile. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was low and careful, as though he were testing the space between us. Still awake? He asked. Yes, I replied, more quickly than I meant to. The honesty surprised me. For a moment, neither of us said anything else. The silence wasn't awkward, but it was heavy, charged with thoughts neither of us seemed ready to release. Eventually, Daniel shifted onto his back, staring up at the dark ceiling of the tent. I don't sleep well anymore, he said. Not like I used to. I didn't know why he was telling me that, but I listened. Daniel rarely spoke about himself this openly, especially not to me. I waited, letting the space invite more. Life gets loud, he continued. Responsibilities. Expectations. You wake up one day and realize you've been doing everything right, and still feel wrong. His words settled uncomfortably close to my own thoughts. I turned slightly toward him, though I kept my distance. I think a lot of people feel that way, I said. They just don't always admit it. Daniel gave a quiet laugh. You're more perceptive than you think, Alex. The way he said my name made me uneasy. Not because it was inappropriate, but because it felt intentional. I reminded myself who he was, my father's friend, a married man, someone whose life was already defined. Still, something about being seen so clearly tugged at me. The next morning passed without incident. We ate breakfast, packed light gear, and spent the day hiking along a narrow trail. Mark walked ahead, content in his own thoughts, while Daniel and I followed. Our conversations were ordinary on the surface, but I noticed how often Daniel looked back to check if I was keeping up. Each glance felt like a question he wasn't asking. By afternoon, clouds rolled in, and the air grew cooler. We returned to camp earlier than planned. Mark decided to rest, retreating into his tent with a book, leaving Daniel and me alone by the fire. The quiet between us returned, but this time it felt less uncertain and more deliberate. Daniel stared into the flames. You ever feel like you're standing at the edge of something? He asked. Not sure if stepping forward will fix anything or ruin it. I knew, instinctively, that he wasn't talking about the view or the trip. My chest tightened. Sometimes, I said. But I try not to stand there too long. He nodded, as if he understood more than I'd said. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. Without thinking, Daniel reached out and brushed ash from my sleeve. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it lingered in my awareness long after his hand fell away. That was the moment I should have stepped back. I felt it clearly, the invisible line, thin but firm, waiting to be respected. Instead, I stayed where I was, telling myself that nothing had really happened. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. Inside the tent, the cold pressed us closer, not by choice but by necessity. We lay side by side, careful at first, then gradually less so. Daniel spoke quietly about his marriage, about how distance had grown where closeness used to be. He didn't speak with bitterness, only resignation. I don't know when we stopped talking, he said. Or maybe we never learned how. I wanted to tell him to talk to his wife, to remind him of the life he had built. Instead, I listened. It felt easier to be present than responsible. When he fell silent, I felt his hand brush against mine, tentative, questioning. I didn't pull away. The contact was small, almost meaningless on its own, but the weight of it was undeniable. My thoughts raced with warnings, about my father, about Daniel's marriage, about who I wanted to be. Yet another voice, quieter but persistent, told me how rare it felt to be this close to someone who seemed to understand me. After a long moment, Daniel withdrew his hand. We should sleep, he said, his voice strained. Yes, I agreed, though I knew sleep would be impossible. As I lay awake, staring into the dark once more, I understood that something essential had already changed. No promises had been made. No rules spoken aloud. But the boundary between us was no longer where it had been, and I feared that crossing back would be far harder than stepping forward. Morning arrived without relief. Adam woke before the alarm, his thoughts already active, circling the same uneasy truths he had avoided the night before. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that invited reflection rather than rest. He lay still, listening to Mark's breathing beside him, and felt the sharp contrast between physical closeness and emotional distance. Nothing visible had changed, yet Adam sensed that the foundation beneath their marriage had shifted. Over breakfast, Adam spoke less than usual. Mark noticed but said nothing, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of fatigue. Their routines continued as they always had, coffee poured, doors closed, goodbyes exchanged, but the familiarity felt fragile now, like something that could crack under a careless word. Adam watched Mark leave and wondered how long silence could serve as protection before it turned into betrayal. Ethan stayed out of sight for the next few days, which only intensified Adam's awareness of him. Absence proved more disruptive than presence. Adam replayed their conversation, the careful way Ethan had offered him a choice rather than an escape. That restraint haunted him. It made Adam question his own motives, the quiet longing that had drawn him towards someone who asked so little yet seemed to understand so much. When they finally met again, it was unplanned. Adam was returning home early, his thoughts scattered, when he found Ethan in the hallway. There was no pretense this time, no small talk to soften the moment. They exchanged a brief greeting, and Adam felt the tension settle between them, familiar and unresolved. Ethan spoke first, his tone steady but sincere. He acknowledged the risk of what they were doing, the cost it could carry for both of them. He said he didn't want to become a secret that damaged a life already under strain. The words struck Adam with unexpected force, because they echoed the doubts he had tried to ignore. Ethan wasn't offering romance or rescue, only honesty. Adam responded with more truth than he intended. He admitted that the distance in his marriage had left him feeling invisible, that being seen again had felt like a reminder of something he'd lost. He did not excuse his feelings, but he did not deny them either. Saying the words aloud made them real in a way thoughts never had. They parted without resolution, but not without understanding. Adam returned to his apartment aware that clarity, not temptation, was now his greatest challenge. He could no longer pretend that nothing had happened. Emotional lines, once crossed, did not reset simply because no one was watching. That evening, Mark asked a question he had avoided for weeks. He wanted to know whether Adam was still happy. The simplicity of it left Adam unprepared. He considered offering reassurance, the practiced answer that would preserve peace, but something in him resisted. For the first time in a long while, Adam chose honesty, even though it frightened him. That he spoke carefully, acknowledging the distance between them without assigning blame. Mark listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Adam finished, the space between them felt heavier, but also more real. Mark admitted he had felt the change too, though he hadn't known how to name it. There was pain in his voice, but also a willingness to confront what they had both avoided. The conversation did not resolve their marriage, but it altered its direction. They agreed to take time, to talk more, to listen differently, to stop pretending that stability alone was enough. Adam did not mention Ethan by name, but the shadow of that truth lingered, unspoken yet present. Later, alone in his room, Adam reflected on the choices unfolding before him. Infidelity, he realized, was not defined by a single act, but by the gradual turning away from one truth toward another. He stood at a crossroads shaped by desire, honesty, and consequence, unsure which path would demand more courage. As night settled in, Adam understood that change had already begun, not because of what had happened, but because of what could no longer be ignored. Whatever came next would require him to decide who he wanted to be, not in secret, but in the open light of accountability. The room was the same, the silence familiar, yet Adam sensed that the story was far. Time did not rush to smooth things over. Instead, it moved with deliberate patience, forcing me to sit with what had happened rather than escape it. In the weeks after my conversation with Daniel, I noticed how carefully I began arranging my days, as if structure could prevent memory from intruding. Work filled my mornings, long walks filled my evenings, and silence occupied the spaces in between. Mark remained unchanged, or at least he appeared to be. He called occasionally, asked how I was doing, talked about ordinary things, errands, repairs, plans that extended comfortably into the future. Each conversation reminded me how fragile trust could be, how easily it could be damaged without anyone realizing it had been tested. I listened more than I spoke, grateful and uneasy at the same time. Daniel faded from my daily life, though not from my thoughts. We didn't meet again, and our contact dwindled to nothing. It felt intentional on both sides, a quiet agreement to let distance do the work we could not. I wondered often how he was managing, whether he had followed through on the resolve he voiced in that cafe. But wondering was all I allowed myself. Reaching out would have reopened something better left undisturbed. What surprised me most was how the experience sharpened my understanding of myself. I had always believed that knowing who I was meant knowing who I loved, what I wanted, and what I would never accept. The camping trip challenged that certainty. It showed me how easily loneliness could disguise itself as connection, and how validation could feel like intimacy even when it wasn't earned honestly. One evening, while sorting through old photos on my phone, I came across pictures from the trip. Trees silhouetted against a gray sky. A fire reduced to glowing embers. No faces. No evidence of the tension that had lived just outside the frame. I stared at them longer than I expected, then deleted them all, not out of anger, but out of recognition. Some memories serve better as lessons than keepsakes. Months passed. Life expanded again, slowly but steadily. I met new people, formed connections that were uncomplicated and open. Each interaction felt cleaner, unburdened by secrecy. I found myself more willing to speak up when something felt uncertain, less inclined to linger in gray areas that offered comfort without clarity. Still, the story stayed with me, not as a source of shame, but as a reminder. It taught me that boundaries are rarely tested by obvious danger. More often, they are challenged by familiarity, kindness, and the illusion of mutual understanding. The most difficult choices, I learned, are the ones that don't feel wrong until much later. The last time I saw Daniel was at a distance, at a gathering I attended briefly before leaving early. Our eyes met across the room, and in that brief moment, there was recognition without invitation. He nodded once, respectfully. I returned the gesture, grateful for the simplicity of it. No words were needed. What had passed between us belonged firmly in the past. As I walked away that night, I felt something close to peace. Not because everything had been resolved perfectly, but because I had chosen not to let a moment define me beyond its lesson. Growth, I realized, often comes quietly, disguised as restraint rather than action. Looking forward, I carry that awareness with me. I am more cautious now, but also more confident in my ability to step back when necessary. The memory of that tent, that trip, that almost choice remains, but it no longer pulls at me. It stands behind me, a marker of where I learned to choose integrity over impulse, and though the story ends here, the understanding it gave me continues, shaping the way I move through the world, steadier, clearer, and far more honest than before.